I find it rather interesting sometimes when our song leaders gets up and with their series of songs that they have, how they don't know if they meant for it to or not, and more than likely they did, but the flow of thought that it provides unto us. The first one, actually about the joyful coming of Christ. And then immediately after that, about the joy of heaven. And then the third one, the hilltops of glory. And that's what we're going to see, and that's where we will be. Of course, that will require the second coming of Christ unless we find ourselves succumbing to a circumstance in this life, to that of death, which is a possibility. Otherwise, if we are alive when Jesus returns, we look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, 7 through 9, a lot of people say, well, that's not a very good reference, we might say, to that of his coming. It is a negative reference, but it's dealing with that of those who have not obeyed the gospel. And it actually is a means of understanding the terror of God, the terror of the Lord, him coming in flaming fire and with a host of angels, taking vengeance upon those that know not God and obey not the gospel. Well, that's not a positive concern necessarily, but do you not understand that in the Bible many, many times, God has always taken seemingly the negative and turned it into a positive, or that would have been his desire for the results of that. And it's the same way today in our lives as we parent our children and so on. There may be times that we have to extend unto them the negative circumstances of parental authority. They may not like that, but what are we doing that for? Is for a positive outcome somewhere down the road. So we see that, we understand that. The same way with Scripture and the same way with that of our songs, and I appreciate very much the songs that were led tonight in that regard. And appreciate Brother Nate taking upon himself the intellectual ability of reading Scripture for us. He said, I don't know if I can pronounce all these names or not. I said, well, just call him George or Joe or something like that, and we'll just let it go. And believe it or not, that actually happened to a friend of mine, a young man who had become a Christian, was not familiar with Old Testament Scripture at all, and obviously not familiar with certain names that became difficult and can still be difficult for me and many of us. When he would read in Bible class, the preacher would have him read Scripture, he never could call these names correctly. And he started calling them George or Joe or whatever. And the preacher would just get all over him for doing that. He said, we can't do that. We have to put the right person in the right place relative to Scripture. So he told the preacher, he said, when I have to read and it comes to one of these names, he said, I'll stop and you just go ahead and call it out. So sometimes we have to work through difficulties, no doubt. But when that happens to us, we realize that whatever it may be, we have an opportunity to learn and to grow. And that's what I want to look at tonight. If you've been looking at the bulletin, and I pray that you have, you've seen the title of my lesson already, Lord, give me this mountain. Now, I want us to think about that for just a moment. I want us to think about Caleb and his circumstances, his individual circumstance as a servant of Jehovah God. And as we'll draw this lesson to a close, it'll be emphasized even more in this circumstance. But I want us to put in mind, relative to our imagination, if that need be, the circumstance of Caleb and how he may have approached Joshua in reference to God and speaking to God, actually, in this circumstance. I don't think he stood back and folded his hands and kind of bowed his head and said, Lord, give me this mountain. I really don't think he did that. I can imagine this individual, I can imagine him standing with his head high. Not that it's necessary or not that it happened this way, but I can imagine also him with his arms stretched out in behoovement, begging and pleading unto Jehovah God, Lord, give me this mountain. He was intent upon it. He was insistent upon this mountain being given unto him. How many of us today approach the Lord's work in similar circumstances? This is going to be the main thrust of my lesson for tonight. But before we get there, let's take some things into consideration. First of all, let's look at our nation today as a whole. There was a time I would consider that where the youth of our nation was one of the primary focuses in regards to a variation of circumstances. And that happens a lot of times. We want to look at youth and their vigor and their energy and all the possibilities that they may have going forward in life. Nothing wrong with that. But I have found in some of my readings that it's rather interesting, beginning somewhere around maybe 4 or 5 decades ago, people in this nation began to be referred to as gray-haired America. I don't know if you've ever heard that or not, but it had to do primarily with the baby boomers from the 60s, or actually post-World War II, coming forward and then gaining their jobs in the society of our nation, and then eventually retiring, which is where many of us are now. We are the baby boomers. I used that phraseology one time in Newport, Tennessee. I walked out to the edge here and was just, I don't remember what I had to say, but instead of saying baby boomers, I said baby bloomers. And then I realized what I'd said. My wife was sitting on the second row back, and I looked at her and I said, "Did I say bloomers?" She goes, "Yeah, just like that." And I said, "Okay, all right, I guess maybe babies did wear bloomers in some time or another. I don't know." But nonetheless, it's funny how those things happen sometimes. Your mind will work tricks on you when it comes to either definitions of things or pronunciations. But anyway, that's where we are. Many of us here in this congregation are a part of that era of time. So because we are in that era of time and we're within that age group of the baby boomers, we are referred to as gray-haired America. Well, I don't find that insulting in any way whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the other day in our men's and preachers meeting, I did a lesson on elders, and I went back to the Old Testament and referenced the many concerns for elders in the nation of Israel and how they were exalted as such, referred to as gray-headed or hoary, referring to those who were gray-headed, was an indication of advancement, no doubt, of life, but not just that. But with the advancement of age came the advancement of knowledge and wisdom and discernment. So in all reality, we as gray-headed America, if you please, that's exactly where we should be. We should be those of the Lord's church that have advanced to that point from our youthful days, if that be the case, of the beginning and the inception of your Christianity, to this very point of being a hoary-headed, gray-headed Christian, that you would have grown in grace and in knowledge. You would have grown in wisdom and in discernment. And in you then resides the majority of the knowledge within the congregation of the Lord's church. Does that seem to be unreasonable? I don't think so. So let's just put ourselves in that given circumstance, if you would. And one of the greatest challenges that I find in this era of time, and remember, I've been at this for some time. I've seen in various congregations similar circumstances. One of the greatest difficulties that elders have today within the Lord's church is harnessing the knowledge and the wisdom and the energy of the chronologically advanced in the congregation of the Lord's church. It's more difficult. Now, why is that? If you're in this circumstance of thought, and I pray that you're not, but yet sometimes many people are, well, let's just leave it to the youth. They have the energy. Let them go forth and do it. Well, you know what? You may be right in regards to the energy of the youth, and to let them do it, though, is another matter, I do believe. Because with that youth, I'm not excluding youth from doing anything. Don't get me wrong. I'm making a comparison, I think, that is very simplified and yet should be very much accepted. You see, within that youth is not the wisdom, and it's not the knowledge, and it's not the discernment of those that are older in the Lord's church. Doesn't mean they can't do it. Doesn't mean there's not things for them to do. But what I'm saying very simply is this, that within that gray-headed Christian group of the Lord's church resides the majority of those things of which we've been discussing. And with many retiring, what we find, or what we should find, because there was a time when people were retiring at 55 years old. And then, if you're going to retire and draw Social Security, we knew that that was slowly but surely being advanced a little farther and a little farther and a little farther ahead. But it really doesn't matter. The idea, very simply, is this. When you retire, and there's no way of knowing this exactly, obviously, how many years could you possibly have left? Once again, we don't know. But let's say that we retire at 65. How much energy of life do you still have at 65? I'll tell you, I'll be 76 next month on the 2nd of February. I'm an old groundhog, as a matter of fact. I'm not a meteorologist, but I am a groundhog. But nonetheless, realizing at that very point in my life, I had no idea what I would feel like or the circumstances of what I'd be involved in at this age. Sometimes when you think of retirement, you think, okay, I'm going home, I'm going to sit down, and that's it. I'm retired. I'm not doing anything else whatsoever. Believe it or not, that is the mindset of some people. And unfortunately, I think that's the mindset of some Christians. I become a certain age, if I'm retired from secular work, then I can retire myself from the work of the church. Oh, they'll attend, they'll occupy their pews, they will involve themselves in worship, but then when worship is over, they're out and they're gone. You do not see them, you do not hear of them in any way whatsoever. You hear of no involvement that they're concerned about in any way regarding that of the Lord's church. You might see them the next Lord's Day morning, and you might not. But if you do see them, it'll only be on Lord's Day morning also. But nonetheless, this is why this particular account in the Old Testament should become so paramount to us all. Let's go back to Numbers 13 and 14. No particular scriptures here, but this lays for us the groundwork. This is the very catalyst and the beginning circumstances of our knowledge of Caleb and the man that he was, the man of God that he was. At this age, he is 40 years old. At this time, in 13 and 14 in the book of Numbers, there were 12 chosen, one out of each tribe of Israel, to go into the land of Canaan and to spy it out. They had a responsibility while they were there. They had to take into consideration the land itself. Was it good land or was it bad land? They had to take into consideration the dwellings of the citizens in these different nations there. Are they in walled cities or fortified cities? Do they live in encampments of some type? Or whatever circumstance it may have been in which they may have had the opportunity to dwell, Moses actually needed to know at this time. Was the land good? Was it fat or was it lean? Did they have wood available? A necessary product for that of fires and that of building and so on. and wanted to know also in regards to this land that would be flowing with milk and honey, in regards to what it produced. And to prove what it produced relative to the grape harvest at this time, evidently the very first grapes that would come into harvest at this time of the year when they were sent in there to spy it out, one branch of one tree was cut with a plume of grapes that were so large and so heavy that it took two of them to carry it back. A land that flowed with milk and honey. So when they returned and they gave the report, all